Today, on the 8th and 9th of May 1945, so many years ago, these were the days of a new Europe. The end of one empire, a dictatorship, comes to an end, and a new one emerges. And for many of the subjugated people, it was hard to distinguish one from the other. And for the women, mainly in Eastern Europe, liberation came with violence, mass rape, and death, and the tacit silence of Churchill and FDR, and initially Truman. FDR had over the years given Stalin everything and more that he needed to create a vast dictatorial communist empire. FDR had provided the dictator weapons, tanks, planes, money, entire factories, and a free run of all American patents and secret weapons, including uranium, to the dictator. FDR had, with his communist sympathies, enabled the Cold War to begin. He allowed for the domination of Stalin over almost all of Eastern Europe, except for Greece. Churchill had himself been sidelined as he saw the danger, although had been fully complicit with this. He was sidelined by the American president. He was threatened and bullied by Henry Morgenthau into silence. He was mocked by Stalin and had himself resolved into tacit acceptance for the better of his country. There had been many better alternatives to FDR's stance and plans, and one would have thought providing war materials for free to Stalin, all that was needed and promised to his ally Britain, who paid for their materials, all of them, or at least prioritized his own armed forces and militaries for these materials. But he did not. He prioritized Stalin. And even when Stalin refused to release captured American airmen from Russian camps, it must be seen as treason when he continued to hand out anything the dictator wanted without even demanding the release of his own soldiers. But today, the guns fell silent, but the cries did not. Already by war's end, the Russians had begun to pillage Eastern Europe and deport its people. Before the war had even ended, more Poles had been deported by the Russians than the Germans ever managed to come close to over 6 years of occupation. And that was a sign of things to come. Stalin had prepared for a war against the West. He had prepared for a war of aggression long ago, but Hitler jumped off a few weeks before he could himself. Still, Stalin always had the intention of spreading communism to the West. He had prepared for a war of aggression. He tried to invade Poland in 1920, but his army was not ready. Now, thanks to American money, know-how, technology, and arms and armor, he had the largest army in the world, with over 12 million soldiers under arms in Europe alone. Comparatively, the U.S. had 1.9 to 2 million soldiers in Europe, the British less, and the Germans around 2 million who were now surrendering. And Stalin stood victorious in Berlin. Patton and many other politicians had warned FDR, but all had been sidelined. It had all been in vain. Today, however, the war in Europe ended, and the retribution could begin. On the Western Front, American, British, Polish, Canadian, French armies had swept through to Western Germany, liberating the Netherlands, Belgium, Western Czechoslovakia, and after crossing the Rhine in March, they faced scattered resistance with German troops trying to surrender to avoid Soviet capture. On the Eastern Front, the Russian Red Army, along with Polish units and Romanian units, advanced through Poland, Hungary, East Prussia. They captured Budapest in February and Vienna on April 13th, setting the stage for one final assault on Berlin. On April 25th, Soviet and American forces linked up at Torgau on the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. The Battle of Berlin launched April 16th. It saw 2.5 million Soviet troops encircle the city, and by April 30th, Hitler was dead. Berlin's defenders, led by General Helmut Wiedling, surrendered to Marshal Georgy Zhukov on May 2nd, along with 80,000 German troops of all nationalities. This marked the fall of Nazi capital. though the fighting still persisted. Many did not wish to surrender to the Russians for good reason. Elsewhere, especially by those soldiers allied to Germany, they knew what to expect, and they fought on wherever they could. Russian helpers, Ukrainians, Poles even, Danes, Norwegians, French, and many others, of course the Cossacks, all had been promised by the American president to be handed over to Stalin, even if surrendering to the Allies, thus breaking the Geneva Convention. The unconditional surrender demand of Germany had been made long ago and cost the Allies many more hard fights and dead soldiers than had been necessary. The president had been warned, but he, fearful of not appeasing Stalin, would never venture from that until his dying day. The surrender occurred between May 7 and 9th, 1945. Local surrenders in various countries and cities unfolded over the days and weeks after, reflecting the chaotic collapse of the German forces. In Berlin on May 2nd, Wiedling surrendered at 6 a.m., signing the capitulation papers at Zhukov's headquarters. The Soviet troops hosted the red flag over the Reichstag, and though mopping up operations continued throughout until May 5th. At Reims, the Western Allies, on May 7th at 2:41 a.m., General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at General D. Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters at Reims, effective on May 8th. This applied to all fronts, accepted by American, British, French, and Soviet representatives. In Berlin, Stalin demanded a separate ceremony for the Soviet-occupied Berlin. Thus, on May 9th, Field Marshal Wiedling Keitel signed another surrender at Karlshorst at 12:16 a.m., formalizing the end of the Eastern Front. May 9th became VE Day in the USSR. In Flensburg, the last Nazi government, led by Karl Dönitz, operated from Flensburg near Denmark until May 23rd, when British forces arrested them, ending all German governance. In Poland, Warsaw had been liberated, shall we say, by the Soviets already in January 1945, saw no major May surrender, but garrisons, like at the Modlin fortress, they capitulated to the Soviets on May 5th with 1,500 German troops, finally surrendering to the Polish army under Soviet command. Scattered Wehrmacht units in Silesia surrendered by May 8th. In Czechoslovakia, Prague, the uprising had begun on May 5th, where Czech resistance fighters fought German forces. On May 8th, German commander Karl Hermann Frank negotiated the surrender to the Czechs, but Soviet forces entered on May 9th, accepting the formal capitulation of 850,000 German troops in Bohemia under General Ferdinand Schroeder, who did attempt himself to get away but was captured. In Hungary, Budapest had fallen in February, but German units in western Hungary surrendered on May 5th near Graz, Austria, to Soviet and Yugoslav forces. Smaller garrisons capitulated by May 7th, with some 10,000 troops laying down their arms. In Holland, on May 5th, at Wageningen, General Johannes Blaskowitz surrendered all German forces in the Netherlands to Canadian General Charles Faulkner, with British oversight. Dutch civilians celebrated liberation as 120,000 Germans was disarmed. In Norway, German forces under General Franz Böhmer, numbering some 400,000, surrendered on May 8th in Oslo to British and Norwegian resistance representatives, with no Soviet involvement. The surrender was formalized at Lillehammer to avoid conflict with retreating Germans. In Denmark, on May 5th, German forces in Denmark surrendered to the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery at Lüneburg Heath. Copenhagen was liberated without combat, with 200,000 German forces disarmed, and many, many refugees. In Austria and Vienna, which was liberated by the Soviets on April 13th, Vienna saw no major May surrender, but German units at Styria surrendered to Soviet and British forces on May 8th near Graz, with 50,000 troops capitulating. In Innsbruck, American forces accepted the surrender of German garrison with minimal resistance. In the Baltic states, the Kurland pocket in Latvia held 200,000 German troops under General Karl Hibbert, who surrendered to Soviet Marshal Leonid Gorovno on May 9th and 10th, with fighting ceasing by May 12th. Smaller garrisons in Vilnius and Tallinn had surrendered earlier in 1944. These surrenders ended the organized German resistance through isolated units fought until mid-May in remote areas like the Channel Islands, which surrendered May 9th, and Slovenia May 15th. The occupation division of Europe. According to the Yalta and Potsdam Conference, FDR had handed Stalin control over all of Eastern Europe, and even continued to send the Russian dictator thousands more tanks and planes and materials, foodstuffs, to get the Russians to join the war against Japan, despite all G2 and American generals were in agreement that Japan was at the end of her fight, and nothing should be given to the Russians. Now divided Germany, Berlin, into 4 zones: Soviet, the East, American the South, British Northwest, and the French Southwest. Austria followed a similar model. German occupied territories were allocated based on military advances. The Western Allies controlled Western Germany and Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, Western Czechoslovakia. They focused on denazification, repatriating 7 million displaced persons, and rebuilding via the Marshall Plan, praising the Lord that the Morgenthau Plan had been abandoned. By 1949, their zones began West Germany, a democratic state. The Soviet Union occupied Eastern Germany, Eastern Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, as was annexed as Soviet republics. These all would become communist satellite states, or republics, by 1949, under Stalin's communist dictatorship. This division birthed the Cold War, with Eastern Europe under Soviet control for over 50 years, marked by political oppression, economic hardship, and control. In Berlin, Hitler had refused women and children to evacuate, and now they paid for it. And remember, Berliners were amongst those who voted the least for Hitler, so one can say they were not responsible, but still they paid. An estimated of 1 to 2 million women were raped in Eastern Germany, with over 250,000 cases in Berlin alone. I don't like to use the term cases when these were all girls and women. Victims ranged from children to the elderly, often assaulted publicly or by multiple soldiers. In Poland, 50,000 plus women were raped. In Silesia, Hungary, saw 10% of Budapest's women victimized during the siege. In Königsberg, Kaliningrad, Soviet troops raped thousands during April-May 1945. With hospitals reporting suicides and deaths from these injuries. To this I can say I have sadly read many of these accounts, and I could never read them or present them here in public. Honestly, many of these have kept me awake many a nights, wondering how people could possibly do this to women and children. I do not recommend you dive into this. It makes horror films seem like children's cartoons. There was, of course, massacres and executions, retributions. Civilians, prisoners of war, faced brutal killings. All began when the Russians set foot on German territory at Nimostov, 1944, killing 74 German civilians, raped and mutilated women. In Metkin, over 3,000 civilians died already in February 1945. In Poland, the NKVD executed 2,000 of the Polish army fighting for the Russians, but not trusted, already in 1945, continuing anti-resistant purges of all Poles that had fought against the Germans, but wished for an independent Poland. You remember the one the French and British had declared war on Germany to preserve. I'm not going to go into more details of who did what to whom. Needless to say, all victorious armies took part in these acts to various degrees, certainly with the Soviets topping out. Also, Soviet soldiers plundered from homes, factories, cultural sites, gutting cities entirely, even Warsaw and Budapest. In East Prussia, 90% of Königsberg's infrastructure was destroyed or looted by May 1945. The Hungarian archives and churches was burned during Budapest's fall. Priests and nuns were, of course, also killed by the Russians. And then there's the deportations and labor. Over 12 million Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, with over 4 million killed or missing in the process. Official numbers are low, as Soviets claim to have deported only 500,000 Poles and 200,000 Balts to the gulags, with a over 30% mortality rate, after, of course, having killed most of the Polish government in exile. Of 4 million Axis prisoners of war, 580,000 died in Soviet camps. In Silesia, 1.5 million Germans were expelled by 1947, with thousands dying in transit or killed by partisans or civilians or locals. These crimes were documented by historians and suppressed in Soviet records, fueled resentment after the war. We know at least 2 million women were raped during this time. The number is probably closer to 4 million, and we never know who disappeared or never reported. None of this, of course, was mentioned in the Nuremberg trials, nor the fact that Stalin had invaded 7 neutral countries by 1941, which is oddly enough exactly the same number as Hitler had invaded at the same time. Yet, instead of letting the dictators simply fight it out amongst themselves, FDR funded and supported and created the very foundation for the Cold War. He gave Stalin everything for nothing. He abandoned all innocent people caught between the two dictators. He rejected any negotiated end to the war, which could have ended much earlier. Nobody short of Stalin can be blamed, if not FDR, for responsibility for what happened in 1945 and the dark century after. The Red Army's atrocities set a grim precedence for Soviet rule. Political repression in Poland, over 100,000 more anti-communists were arrested by 1947. Hungary saw uprisings that was oppressed in 1956, and Czechoslovakia, 1968 Prague Spring, were also crushed by Soviet tanks. The demographic toll that Poland lost over 20% of its population during the war, some 5.8 million killed, with Soviet actions post-1944 exacerbating these losses. The Baltic states saw 10% of the population deported, but not to mention those deported by the Russians before 1941. And of course the cultural loss. Sovietization erased all local identities, churches, memoirs, looted museums, banned languages in various countries such as Estonia and Latvia. For over 50 years, these nations endured Soviet communist dominance, with memories of 1945 atrocities fueling resistance, like Poland's Solidarity movement years later. The final days of the Second World War saw Germany's surrender in cities like Berlin, Prague, and Oslo, ending Nazi occupation, but ushering in a divided Europe with a new dictatorship in the East, while Western allies rebuilt democracies, since we have seen American soldiers apologize for their misdeeds in those days, which some committed. British soldiers, too, have apologized, and even some French have come to the cross for some of the bad, horrible things they did at the end of the war. The Germans, of course, have lived on their knees begging for forgiveness for the deeds of their parents, ever since, to the point where any mention of any type of patriotic fervor in Germany have been deemed outright outlawed, again rewarding the communists who so brutally subjugated the country for half a century. The Russians, however, have never expressed any guilt or regret over the lives of the millions of women they have ruined, murdered, and tortured. War is a terrible thing. Let's never forget that. We are human beings, and we will, from time to time, see the need to fight. But if we must fight, can we not agree that we as men should fight to protect the innocent, the women and the children, as men should? At least they're worth fighting for, if nothing else is.
My name is Tino Struckmann. I run Lost Battlefields. Every year, I travel around the world to try to bring you to all the most interesting historical military locations from modern wars and the World War II special projects, battlefields, forts, fortresses, and tunnels, everything else. Things you may not be able to see or go to yourselves. Please join me on Patreon or join Lost Battlefields through the website so you get access to all my files and my notes. It really does help, and like, follow, share here on the channel if you can. That helps too.